So good day, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on negotiating or renegotiating a dental office lease. My name is Jeremy Behar. I'm with a company called Cirrus Consulting Group, and for over 2 decades now, we've been providing dental office lease support to dentists across Canada and the United States, helping them effectively deal with this part of the dental practice, this important part, certainly one of the most expensive parts of running and operating a successful dental practice. And the purpose of today's webinar is to dig into this component of a dental practice and understand it a little bit better. Whether you are starting up a practice, renewing a lease agreement for an existing practice, expanding your dental office, potentially relocating the practice, planning a transition sometime in the next 10 years, or even if you own your own building and have your practice in your building and are looking to understand a little bit more carefully and better how to structure a relationship between your building that you own and your practice that you own, today's program should be fairly insightful. A little bit about us before we get going, because I think it's important that you understand who we are and why it is that we are providing you with the content on this webinar today. Cirrus Consulting Group is a firm that was founded back in 1994 by dentists for dentists to help the dental community more effectively negotiate their dental office leases with landlords who, on the other side of the table, are professionals at ensuring that every day they get the very best deals out of their tenants, including dentists. In the last over 2 decades since we've been in business, we've been involved in negotiating over 10,000 dental office leases. We represent and act for over 1,000 dentists a year across North America. We have an in-house legal, leasing, and consulting department that all weigh in on ensuring that the lease agreement and the real estate strategy for the practice fit the doctor's life plan, as opposed to wrapping their life plan around some arbitrary document called a tenant lease. We do over 150 CE courses a year across the country, some of the largest lectures in the country, all the way through to regional conferences, local programs, and study club meetings, and everything in between. And of course, webinars like the one that you're on today. And finally, we truly work with dentists in every state in the U.S. and every province in Canada, and really our goal is to educate and help people get a better deal. So just moving on to the next slide, the purpose of today's seminar is to really tie in and hammer down the importance of the office lease agreement and really talk about how the dental office lease is more important a document in the dental community as a segment of the small business population of North America as opposed to just about any other small business tenant, whether it's healthcare related, family physicians, veterinarians, or whether it is non-healthcare related, accountants, legal offices, insurance offices. Today we're going to talk about why the dental office lease specifically in this industry is a more critical tool and component to helping to preserve, grow, and eventually sell the value of a dental practice. We're then going to dig into a couple of key terms in lease agreements, and then we will get into a little bit of practical advice and strategic advice on how to position oneself, time oneself into getting ready to start a negotiation and really preparing and planning to succeed and get the most value out of the lease negotiation with a landlord. So before we get going, I ask this question when I do this lecture live across the country, and the question is very simple. What is a lease agreement? So I will answer this, being that it's a webinar and it's one way. A lease agreement is it's 2 things. Number one, and I guess the real sort of technical formal answer is, it's an agreement between 2 parties, a landlord and a tenant, that spells out the specific factors and variables involved in a tenancy. So for a landlord, what they are interested in is knowing who the tenant is, how long they stay for, how much they're going to pay, and what other obligations they have. So for example, cleaning obligations. For a tenant, a lease agreement is important because, again, very similarly, they want to know where the property is and what specifically the space is that they're renting. They want to know how much the cost of that space is in year one and how that cost will increase over time. They want to know how long they have an ability to stay in that space for by way of term and options. And then there's all kinds of other flexibilities that's important in a lease agreement that we'll get into. The other thing, I think, less formally, that we refer to a lease agreement as is what we refer to as a check. And a lease agreement really is in dentistry one of the most expensive checks that a dentist can write in their career. So I ask this question all the time in my seminars: what's the single biggest financial commitment a dentist will make in their life? And most people typically raise their hand and they say, well, when we buy a home, it's the single biggest purchase we make. And the answer is that's correct outside of the dental world. But in the dental world, the single biggest expense that a dentist has in their life is as it relates to the occupancy expenses of their practice. When you add up the amount of rent that gets paid by a dental tenant over the lifetime of one's career, call it 25, 30, 35 years, perhaps even longer for some, when you add up that amount of money, it is a staggering number. It's huge. Now, I'm not saying that and being critical and saying it's not the right way to go or the right path, because it's a great path to go. It's a wonderful thing to be able to rent space and then use that space in someone else's building to be able to run your own successful small business. But the purpose of me telling you that a lease agreement is a check is simply to help you understand that you're spending a lot of money with your landlord, aka this supplier to your business. You're spending a tremendous amount of money with them every 2, 3, 5, 10 years, every time you renew on a new document and agree to spend more money with them over the next term. And the point is that anytime you're about to spend that kind of money in any other part of your life, you are going to try to figure out how to get mileage, as much mileage as you can out of that very big purchase. And yet, somehow this phenomenon is, as it relates to lease agreements, we agree to write these checks, to sign these long-term commitments with landlords, and yet we then go ahead and we sign a 30, 40, 50-page lease agreement with all kinds of terms and conditions in it without really fully trying to figure out, aside from the rent per square foot, how do we get mileage out of this commitment, this relationship, this agreement to give the landlord money every month for the next 10 or longer years. And that's something that as a group, as tenants, we have not done well over the years, and it's one of the things that we try to teach tenants is you're spending a lot of money. Like all other aspects of your life, you should be trying to get mileage out of this commitment that you're about to make with the landlord or recommitment that you're about to make if the lease agreement is a renewal. Now, I've used the word mileage a few times. What do I mean by that? Very simple. Why is the dental office lease more important in this industry of dentistry than in just about any other industry that exists? Why is the dental office lease a critical component of gluing all the value of the practice together over time? And the first point that I want to talk about is the fact that dental practices are tremendously expensive assets to acquire or build. When we get out of dental school, we go and typically find an associateship for a few years, and we spend a few years associating, and then we get to a point typically in the life cycle of the average dentist where we are ready to acquire our own practice. Now, how do we get into owning our own practice? One of two paths typically. We either build a practice in an empty space, rent it, build it, and open it up, and then start to grow it from zero in production upwards. Or path B, we find an exiting or retiring dentist somewhere in our community, and we buy the practice from them and take it over and run it. Now, either way, whichever path we go down is expensive. B, it is very difficult to pick up and move it. C, if we chose at some point, or somebody chose for us, to take the keys to that space away, it would take us a significant amount of time to find a new home for that practice, to relocate it. This is not a get the keys taken away on a Friday and be open in a new location across the street on a Monday kind of business that we're in dentistry. Unfortunately, in many parts of the country, the timelines to go through a practice relocation are somewhere between 8 and 12 months, sometimes longer. And so because of all these things that I've just referred to, and all of these limitations and restrictions on the asset that we have, which is the physical plant, the dental practice, the box where the plumbing, the electrical is plugged into, runs under typically a few inches of concrete. We've got cabinetry sometimes that perfectly fits, was measured, built, and perfectly fits into the operatories in that particular space. We need to make sure that when we sign or re-sign commitments with landlords, that we are doing so in a way that gives us the most amount of room or runway available ahead of us to ensure that our practice does not get disrupted, certainly doesn't get disrupted by surprise, whereby we're either at the end of the tracks, the end of the term, or we're not at the end of the term, but somehow the landlord put themselves in a position where they could replace us with another tenant who wants to pay 50 cents a square foot more. And so long-term stability and security is key. And what do I mean by that as an example? We shouldn't be signing 2-, 3-, and 5-year leases, generally speaking, in dentistry. We should be signing 10-year leases plus as many 5-year options to renew as we can get as part of our negotiation strategy. Number 2, we should be trying to minimize our risk and exposure. I was just on a call with a dentist this morning in Southern California who, at 50, is relocating his dental practice. And he has been presented with 2 or 3 proposals from other landlords, and every one of those landlords referred to him as the tenant or under the tenant line in their proposals with his name personally. It actually said, and I'll make this name up, it's not the real one, Dr. Jim Smith, DDS, an individual. And all 3 landlords wrote the leases in a way that reflects that he personally will be the tenant. Now, the issue with that is that he is taking on a significant amount of exposure and liability by agreeing to sign the lease personally. If you sign a lease personally, here's what it means. It means that in the event that at any point there was a default on the lease, or he and the landlord ever got into any kind of dispute over anything, that the landlord could pursue all of his family assets, this dentist's family assets, to recover damages. And as we get older as dentists and we pay down our debt and we start to build up our net worth, our asset value over the lifetime of our career, we have more and more and more to protect than when we were in our 20s or 30s, certainly as we get into our 40s, 50s, and 60s. And so as such, it's critical that we carefully manage that component of the lease agreement. Now, what is an alternative way of signing a lease? Well, I'll point you to your lease, and I'd ask you this question. When you take a look at your lease agreement, who is the landlord? Is the landlord on your lease agreement an individual name of a person? Or is the name of the landlord on your agreement some type of corporation, some kind of incorporated company, some kind of LLC, limited liability company? The answer is that 98% of the time, landlords, when they're even remotely sophisticated, know that these are not documents they should be signing personally because there's too much risk and exposure. And this webinar today is one of the things it's here to do is to teach you that you too should be using that knowledge to understand how to sign dental office leases and how not to sign dental office leases. Next point, the dental office lease should help you maximize your flexibility. How do we do this? Why do we need flexibility? Well, it's very simple. I'll give you a couple of examples of real-life flexibility that a typical dental practice needs today. If any of you at some point are considering that you may sell your dental practice anytime within the next 50 years, then you need flexibility built into your lease to enable you to sell that practice. If you don't have language in the lease agreement that gives you the ability to transition out of the practice and transfer the lease out of your name and into the name of a buying dentist or the buying dentist who's interested in your practice, then you're going to have a problem. And so that's one example. And by the way, on that example, we will look at that particular clause in just a few minutes, so hang tight. Another example of maximum flexibility is a dentist that goes and signs a 5 or 10-year lease agreement because we suggested that that was the right way to go. And then 2 years into that 10-year lease agreement, they're driving on the freeway one day, and an accident occurs, and it knocks them off the side of the road, and they die. 2 years into a 10-year lease, and they're now gone. They've signed this lease. There's 8 years left of term on this lease agreement. In other words, 8 years worth of rental payments that still have to get paid whether the dentist is around or not. So now what happens? Well, what happens is the dentist's family or estate is now saddled with having to pay 8 years worth of rent over the next 8 years broken down by months. And in the event that that does not happen or the rents don't get paid, the landlord, because the dentist signed the lease personally, is now able to go after and sue the family or the estate for the unpaid amount of rents that are still on balance. How do you fix this problem? How do you solve this problem? Well, one of the ways a lease agreement can provide a dentist with flexibility is by the use of what we call death and disability provisioning. And what death and disability provisioning does is it enables the dentist or his or her family or estate to terminate the lease early in the event of a catastrophic incident. So if that happened, we were able to turn to the back of the lease, hit the proverbial button, exit button, get out, pay a small penalty or a small amount of money in consideration of the fact that we're getting out, and be gone and no longer have to spend years and years and years feeding that lease agreement. So that's another example of flexibility, and there are literally dozens of examples of flexibility that should form part of a typical dental office lease. This is the part, the fair and affordable financial terms, that most dentists in the country get tripped up on. And when I say tripped up on, it's very simple. It's the smokescreen. It's the part of a lease agreement or a letter of intent that most tenants, not just dentists, but tenants in general, spend 95% of their time or more laser focused on trying to take the quoted rent or the asking rent and negotiate it downwards without any real clear sense of how far down do they want to go. And when we poll people, they tell us, well, they just want to get it down as much as possible, which is silly because landlords then what they do is they just inflate their ask and figure that if they're going to come down by $2 or $3, they'll just build it in, and by the time the rents come down by $2 or $3 and the tenant feels like they've won something, that now the rest of the negotiations are over and all these documents now get signed. So the point of this bullet is make sure before getting into any kind of rent rate negotiation, again, whether it's on a startup practice for a new lease or whether it's on a renewal, do the research. Figure out what's happening in the marketplace around you. Look at what's happening by way of occupancy rates, rental rates. Are they going up? Are they going down? Markets are dynamic. There's nothing static about commercial rents, and they really never stay the same in just about any market in the country. They're always either moving up or moving down, depending on what pace, either fast or slowly. And what you need to do is determine what is the value of your space, not based on what the landlord is telling you it is, but what the market suggests that it is through the collection of research to help us determine what the market value is, because the market doesn't lie. The market value is what it is because it takes into consideration that different landlords have to compete with each other for their vacant space, for new tenants, and then use that information to help position you to getting a better deal. The last thing I will say as it relates to rents is, if you make a mistake and overpay a landlord at renewal time or at the front end of a new lease, that mistake doesn't just last for the first month or the first year. That mistake may follow you for the next 20 years of your career, simply because it's very easy to slip into allowing landlords to raise rents. It's far more difficult to somehow convince a landlord who you believe is overcharging you to step backwards and accept less money for the same product that they're collecting money on today. So critical point, and I don't really want to gloss over this one, but this one could be a 4-hour webinar in and of itself. And then the last point, the lease agreement as it relates to transition is so critical. One of the single biggest referral sources that we have at Cirrus Consulting Group over the course of a year, and this has been going on for 2 decades now, are practice transition specialists and brokers. Why? Because they are the ones that are being tasked by the community to sell practices when a doctor wants to exit. And everything goes great, smoothly. They market the practice. They do an open house. They get people through. 1 or 2 people raise their hand and emerge as the front runners. Somebody puts in an offer. It goes back and forth a couple of times. Price is agreed upon. Then they come into the office. They kick the tires. They pull patient charts. They take a look around. They figure out, are they comfortable or not with what they're getting? The lawyers now start to cross T's and dot I's on the documents. And then lo and behold, at the last minute, at the 11th hour, somebody remembers that they've got to ask the landlord for permission and approval to take the seller off the lease and put the buyer's name on the lease. And this is where things get fun, because landlords have gotten and are continuing to get smarter over the years, and they know that when they are asked by a dental tenant of theirs to approve an assignment, that more often than not, a significant amount of money is exchanging hands. And sometimes, just sometimes, they want a piece of that action. And so pay attention to the lease agreement, whether you are in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, or 70s. Make sure that the lease agreement that you're on today or the one that you're about to renew or sign is transferable. Make it an asset to the sale of a practice as opposed to a liability to the sale of a practice. We'll talk about assignment clauses in a minute. One last comment on this, and that is, many, many years ago, I sat in a lecture at one of the big national dental conventions, and I remember that there was a speaker, an accountant, who was up in front of a room full of new grads and young associates. And one of the things that he said to them, which I've been stealing and sharing with dentists ever since then, is no matter how old you are and no matter at what age you get into dentistry in your first practice for the first time, build your practice and plan everything around you, the lease agreement, retirement planning, wills, etc. Make sure that everything is set up in the event that at some point you may go through an unexpected transition of your dental practice. In other words, be ready to exit and sell anytime, because sometimes, and for some people, and certainly we've met many dentists over the past 2+ decades that have been in these situations, sometimes, despite the fact that you have a well-intentioned life plan of when you're going to eventually retire and how it's going to go and what it's going to look like and how much money you're going to have in the bank, sometimes life surprises us. And when that happens, it's better to be positioned and ready to be able to do what you have to do as opposed to be scrambling at that point. Okay, moving right along now. We talked a minute ago about the sale of a practice and being prepared for transition. So really, I guess, and this applies more to general dentists than specialists, orthos, perios, endos, but really, generally speaking, what are the key ingredients that we're selling when we sell a dental practice? And those three ingredients are the lease agreement, the patient base or the goodwill, and the equipment. Those are really the three components that make up a GD practice that formulate the bulk of the value. Now, if I was selling my practice and I listed my practice for $750,000 and a bunch of people came along and looked at it and said, yeah, no, it's worth $750,000, it's a good little practice, no problem, and somebody came along and agreed to give me $750,000 for my practice. And then the very next day, the landlord either decided to terminate the lease because they had the right to do it and give me 30 days notice of termination, or the landlord decided to force me through a relocation to the other side of the shopping center at my expense in 30 days. Is my practice still worth $30,000? Not 30, $750,000. And the answer to that is, don't know. We have no clue at that point what the practice is worth. The practice now has had the lease agreement taken out from underneath it. It no longer has a lease agreement. It no longer has that continuity, that long-term stability and security that we talked about at the beginning. So now, all of a sudden, the practice, which was nicely and tightly glued together over the past 20 years and was worth, in accordance with what the market was prepared to pay, $750,000, is now worth something between $750,000 on the high end, but unlikely anywhere close to that, and $0 on the low end, because someone now has to come in and spend $285,000 rebuilding that practice elsewhere, whether it's on the other side of the shopping center or whether it's 2 blocks away in the only vacant space that they could find. And so, again, critical component of the lease. Now, of the practice. I'm not suggesting that the dental office lease is the most important part of a practice, because I don't believe that. I believe that the most important part of a dental practice is the dentist or dentists that work in it. And everything then falls and cascades sort of below that to support the dentist. But certainly, the dental office lease formulates the glue, the foundation that holds the rest of the practice together and makes sure that it's held together not only long enough to enable you to get to the point in your career where you're ready to transition and sell, but in addition to that, you want to make sure that you have enough term and option left to satisfy the conditions of a buyer who would then have to go to a bank, a borrower, and get them to lend them money in order to now come in and buy this practice from you. They're going to have a requirement of a minimum amount of term. Typically, it's 8 to 10 years. If the lease doesn't accommodate for that, then the buyer's going to come back to you and say, can't buy your practice. We've got a problem. We've got to figure out how to get through this. So again, this pie graph, critical part of typical dental practice. Now we're going to spend a minute and we're going to dig into the lease agreement. And there's a couple of clauses that I want to take you through to get a bit technical, but not terribly technical, but enough to give you a bit of an understanding on sections of the lease agreement that are commonly found in just about everyone's lease. First one we're going to begin with is what we refer to as the option to renew or option to extend. In this clause, and this clause is paraphrased, and by the way, of those over 1,000 dental office leases that we get sent to our office every year for analysis, this option to renew provision is typical of what we see in a dental office lease. And let me take you through some of the issues that are found in this dental office lease and this clause. It starts off by saying that provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant. So first of all, the landlord has now given you an option to renew, but made it very easy for them to take it back. How? Simple. As soon as that tenant is no longer the original tenant that signed the lease, whether you're the original tenant or you bought the practice thinking there were options from a dentist who was the original tenant, as soon as the practice changes hands and gets transitioned from one person to the next, the options to renew evaporate. They're no longer there because it says clearly, as long as the original tenant is still there, but if they're gone, options are gone. And if the tenant has duly and regularly paid its rents and performed its covenants and obligations under this lease and has not been in default. Here's the problem with this part. The landlord has tied your options to renew to you being in good standing and not in default. The challenge here is this, that after doing this and being in this business for over 20 years now, one of the things that we know at Cirrus Consulting Group is that the average dentist defaults 4 times every 10 years. 4 times every 10 years. Now, that doesn't mean that they've run out of money and can't pay rent, because that may be what's in some of your minds, but it means that in the 40, 50, 60, 70 sometimes pages of clauses and conditions, that something gets missed or skipped. And it could be something as benign as the cleaners on a Tuesday evening when they're done in your space leave a bag of garbage in the hallway by mistake, they forget to come back and pick it up, and that is considered a default. And now you've put the landlord in a position where, again, they can take away the options to renew. It then goes on to say, it shall have the option to renew this lease for a further term of 5 years, exercisable by a written notice to the landlord no less than 9 months prior to the end of the term. Any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. So you've now exercised the option to renew. It's now a new landlord who bought the property 40 years ago. They respond back to you and say, hey, thanks for exercising the option to renew. Glad to see you're sticking around for the next 5 years. You're now bound to stick around for the next 5 years since you've now triggered that option. By the way, attached is 4 copies of our new 162-page standard form lease agreement. We require that they get signed and sent back to us within 5 business days, otherwise you're in default. What we've done here, ladies and gentlemen, is we've agreed to whatever document they come up with at that time of renewal. They're now in a position where they can send it to us, and we really have no rights to review it and negotiate it without being able to get out of it, and that's a problem. And then it goes on to say, at a minimum rent to be determined between the landlord and tenant, but in no event shall it be less than the rents paid in the last year of the original term. In other words, when you exercise the option to renew provision, the rents can only go up or stay the same, but they definitely cannot go down. That's what we've agreed to here in this red text. Well, here's the problem. Market rents are dynamic, as we talked about a few minutes ago, and rents and rates go up, and rents and rates eventually come back down again, and it's cyclical. And if our renewal period or a term of our renewal or date ends up on the bottom end of a cycle where we started off paying higher rents at the front end of that 5-year term, and now at the end of that 5-year term, the market rates are lower actually than what we're paying, and we go ahead and exercise the option to renew, we've just artificially given the landlord more rent than we should be for the value, market value of the product that we're buying, because we agreed in this option to renew provision that rents can only stay the same or go up, but they cannot come down. Traps many, many, many dentists a year, and as a result costs sometimes tens of thousands of dollars a year, more than it should be, because of those 8 or 9 words in here. And then finally it says, if the landlord and tenant are unable to agree on the market rent within 60 days of the exercise by the tenant of its option to renew, the rent shall then be determined by arbitration based on the market rent for renewing tenants in the building. Based on the market rent for renewing tenants in the building. What if the most recently renewing tenant in the building was Starbucks? What if the most recently renewing tenant in the building needed, in order to renew, to go through a facelift, a cosmetic uplift of their space, and needed to spend $100,000 doing it, but didn't have the money to do it, so they agreed to borrow the $100,000 from the landlord and add 20% as a premium to the rent per square foot every year for the next 5 years until that $100,000 plus 20% interest got paid back. And now you're in a position where you've given the landlord the ability to base your renewing rents on what that person just paid, even though they got $100,000 back and you won't be. So be very, very careful with your options to renew and what they look like and how they're written and built specifically to help landlords increase the amount of money they're able to achieve. And read these things, because this is one of the most commonly, one of the 10 most common traps and issues that we find located in dental office leases that ends up costing dentists a lot more money a year than it should be. Next clause, we've talked about this for a few minutes already, is the assignment provision, and this is a clause that we need. Every dental practice needs this in its lease agreement. It's what makes dentistry different from just about any other industry, is that overwhelmingly there's continuity in dentistry where the practice outlives the dentist that started it or runs it or owns it today. And therefore, we need continuity facilitated into or built into the lease agreement. This assignment clause is found in 75% of the leases that we review per year. And it goes along the lines of, if the tenant should wish to assign or sublet the lease premises, it shall first have received the consent of the landlord, period. It doesn't say anything about not to be unreasonably withheld or delayed. It just says that you need the landlord's permission. And by the way, the landlord has the ability here to say, no, we're not interested in giving you the right to assign. It then goes on to say, any request for such consent shall be in writing. Within 15 days after the receipt by the landlord of such request for consent, the landlord shall have the option to either terminate the lease or to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term to the greater of the then current market rent for the lease premises, or 15% greater than the then current rent. Here's the problem. Let's take our eyes off this language for a minute and just listen for a moment. What you've done, if you've got this language in some way, shape, or form built into your lease, is you've given the landlord an ability to make a lot of money in a very short period of time, and here's how. You're the seller of a dental practice. You go to the landlord, you ask the landlord for permission in writing to assign the lease agreement to the buyer. The landlord asks you one very simple question. How much are you selling your practice for? You say, it's none of your business. Landlord says, let me try this again. How much are you selling your practice for? And by the way, it is my business, since you need me to consent to the request in order to enable you to move through this process and actually sell and retire. So how much are you selling your practice for? You then proceed uncomfortably to tell the landlord that you're selling your practice for $800,000. The landlord, because of the language in red that's on the screen in front of you right now, says to you, tell you what we'll do. If you write us a check for 50% of the proceeds of the sale, $400,000, we will give you permission to assign and transfer. You turn every color in the rainbow and then say to the landlord, that's unfair, that's unreasonable, you can't do that. The landlord says, read your lease agreement. Oh, and by the way, we're going to give you 3 business days now to determine whether you're in agreement with us that we deserve $400,000 to allow this to happen. And if you don't get back to us within 3 business days, then we're going to have a letter couriered to your office that's your termination notice, and we're going to exercise our right to terminate your lease within 30 days from now, which means that we want you out. And what we'll probably do is find another dental practice or dentist that wants to come in the day after you leave, get terminated, and open up and start running a practice. And so we'll leave that with you, doctor, and you can think about it and get back to us within 3 days. That happens across the country more often than one thinks, because we're the ones who get the calls when this happens, and it happens everywhere. And it's happening with a greater or an increasing frequency because it is a very easy, quick, by the way, legal, just so you know, way of making money when one's a landlord. And so please read your assignment provision. if you are planning to sell your practice within 50, 40, 30, 20, 10, or less years, read the assignment provision and make sure that if this language somehow is in there, that you've identified that it's in there and that you formulate a plan to get this language out. Then it goes on to say, notwithstanding the landlord's consent to any assignment or subletting, the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under the lease and shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignees or subtenants to observe each and every covenant of the lease. So now that the wound is open, what the landlord's doing here is getting out the salt shaker and saying, hey, by the way, and after we've done this to you and taken money from your pocket and extorted you and done a very bad thing, you, selling doctor, are going to remain on the hook, which means that in the event that this young dentist that comes in and buys the practice at any point defaults in any sort of way, we reserve the right to always be able to come after you in retirement because we know that you have money in your bank accounts and that they, at least for the next 10 or 15 years, probably won't have lots of it. And so that is a major, major problem. The assignment provision, folks, is really a clause that one needs to pay attention to in dentistry more so than any other small business segment in the country today. Other components of the dental office lease that we believe are critical, here's just a few of them. So here's one of them on the top left, third down, relocation clause. Again, we just talked about the fact that landlords have language built into leases increasingly that gives them the right to move you somewhere else in the building. And by the way, if you think that they're going to pay to rebuild your dental office, you should reread that clause in your lease agreement because it says very clearly or omits to say who's going to pay for it, and therefore gray is not good and vague. Vague is not good, and typically it would be that it would be at your expense and sometimes on very short notice. Here's another one. We talked about death and disability, 4 from the top left. All the way on the bottom right, financial statements. We're giving landlords permission in our lease agreements to ask us for our personal and our practice financial statements unnecessarily. There is no reason in the world why we should be giving landlords exposure to this part of our practice, i.e. how much money we earn, how much production, how much net income the practice makes, how much we take out of the practice each year. This information is just not necessary. And so my suggestion is take a look through your lease agreement, and if it states in there at any point that the landlord shall have the right to ask the tenant at any point for financial statements, that's something that you want to have on your negotiation checklist and be prepared to negotiate that point because you don't want to give them that exposure. I want to talk about the tenant lease cycle for a minute because I think the single most practical thing that I can teach you on today's webinar is when to actually start the process of negotiating or renegotiating a lease agreement. And unfortunately, I think that many tenants don't pay enough attention to their critical dates and when the lease is coming up for expiry and start the negotiation process with too little time between then and the end of the lease term. And so I said earlier that it takes 8 to 12 months on average to build or move a dental practice somewhere in the country. So if we know that it would take us 8 to 12 months, let's just go with 12 months, that it would take us 12 months to pick up and move our dental practice, and yet we waited until there was 4 months left on the end of our lease agreement to actually pick up the phone and start talking to the landlord, if the landlord was half smart, they would know that you're not going anywhere. They would know that in order for you to go somewhere else to one of their competitors, maybe for a slightly better deal per square foot, that you would be down by about 8 months. You'd be dark. There'd be nowhere for the practice to open up its doors and see patients for 8 months during that period of time. And we all know in dentistry that if our lights are off and doors are locked for even a week, let alone a month or 6 months or 12 months, that patient attrition just continues to go up and up and up. And eventually, at the appropriate time, when long enough time has passed, we have very little patient base left to bring to and fill up the operatories when we get to the other side. And so the critical point as it relates to this tenant lease cycle is the ideal time to start the process of renewing or renegotiating a lease is 24 months prior to the end of the term. Please start the process. Start looking at your lease agreement at least 24 months prior to the end of the term. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're 23 months or less that you're pooped. It doesn't mean that there's no good strategy for you to figure out how to turn the clock backwards and position yourself effectively and know what you're asking for and then start to make your way through the process in a way that gives you the greatest chance of a predictable outcome. It just means that if you are starting a lease, midway through a lease, or getting close to the end, you give yourself the best chance of success by having the maximum amount of time between now and the end of your lease term, because your landlord knows you've still got lots of leverage on your side of the table, and leverage by way of time is what helps you balance out the equation a little bit and get yourself better terms and ultimately a better deal, and that's critical. So again, at the risk of repeating myself, please, 24 months at least prior to the end of the term. So this is something I want to run through real quickly because it's something that we've developed and refined over years. This is our process that we go through when we get engaged and hired to help a tenant, a dentist, through a lease negotiation for a startup or a renewal lease negotiation. It starts in box number 1 by pulling all the documentation together. What does that mean? It means market rates. It means letter of intent. It means any lease agreements. It means any historical amendments, addendums, assignment documents. Commercial real estate and leases in general are an incredibly paper-intensive part of your practice. There's lots of it. And what you need to do to begin the process is start by gathering and pulling together all the information, because each one of those documents formulates the piece to a puzzle. And only by looking at the entire puzzle completed as one picture will one really understand what the landlord knows about your tenancy, where it's going, and how to position yourself. And step number 2, you want to identify what you're trying to accomplish as it relates to the lease agreement. What are we trying to achieve here? Number 3, review the lease. Start on page 1, end on page 40 or 50 or 70 or 90. Get out a few highlighters and read the lease and go through it by highlighting things that just don't seem right and don't make sense to you, because quite frankly, that's what we do here, is we read the lease from cover to cover, and that's the only way to figure out where the issues are, because if we don't figure out where the issues are, how do we know what we're negotiating? We then layer in some market research where we go out to the marketplace and understand what's happening by way of trends, dynamics. Are occupancy rates going up and down? Are vacancy rates going up or down? Are rental rates going up or down? How much vacancy is there in your building, et cetera, et cetera. By understanding these dynamics, these aspects of the marketplace, will we then know how to best predict what the landlord's going to ask for? Number 2, why they're going to ask for that? And number 3 is where we should be trying to push them to by way of a fair deal for both us and them. Number 5, again, this is where we go back to what are we trying to accomplish? What's our strategy? How old are we? Because when we're in our 30s versus our 40s or 50s or 60s or 70s, we need different things. We're trying to achieve different wins for different stages in our career and our lives. And therefore, what we should be doing every 5 years or 10 years is relooking at what do we need our lease to do for us for the next 10 versus what we needed it to do for us in the last 10 years of our career. Because your goals will change and your priorities will change, and it's important to reflect that into the lease strategy. Number 6, this is where we start negotiating with the landlord on the economics of your new deal, whether it's a renewal or a new deal. What do I mean by economics? Rental rates, rental rate increases, term, options to renew, all of those financial aspects of your deal, free rent, deposits, tenant improvement allowance, anything economic related now gets negotiated at that step 6. Step 7, now we get into the lease agreement itself. This is where the landlord or the landlord's attorney sends us a copy of the document, and that's where we start to pull it apart and review it in the context of, or through the lens of, what is in here is by way of language that is not, it doesn't make sense, it's not right. We would never sign it, we would never allow a client to sign it. How do we want to position this negotiation to re-engineer that particular clause? And we go through that from one end of the document to the other. Once we've come to an agreement with the landlord on what the new document looks like, we then get things ready for final review. When the landlord sends us, if they do indeed send us the final copies to be signed, we don't let them go to our client first. We read them. It's very simple. The reason why we go through them before we allow our clients to sign them is because at the end of a negotiation process, even if you're doing this on your own or someone else is doing this for you, the documents get prepped, and they get sent to you. And what do most people do? They pull out their pen and they sign the documents and they send them back to the landlord for execution. The problem is that no one read those final agreements, and everyone assumed that the landlord was being honest and put into those leases exactly what was agreed upon in the previous 2 or 3 months of negotiations, and unfortunately, that's not always the case. And we only realize that we made a mistake by missing that step in the process 2, 3, 4 years later when something in the bad happens as it relates to the lease agreement, and it's too late because we go back, we open the lease, we read it, we look at it, we realize that that thing that the landlord just did to us, like relocate us, is actually in the lease. It's in there. It's that we agreed to it, and we signed the agreement because we never looked at, did it get taken out as the landlord agreed to do during our negotiations between the time that we had the conversation with them and when the document was prepared and put into writing and duplicated into 4 copies and sent to us for execution. So again, this process wheel that you see in front of you right now, it's like any other process in your business, in our business. It's the way a pilot steps onto a plane and gets himself ready to run through a pre-flight checklist. When you have a process, you give yourself the best chance of the most predictable outcome, and this is the process that we use. Last but not least on today's webinar, we offer 2 services. One is when our clients engage us to fully negotiate the lease agreement from start to finish, but I'm not here to talk about that today. What I would like to share with you today is for any of you that have a lease agreement or for any of you that are looking to sign a new lease agreement for the first time, we are prepared to review that lease agreement for you, and we're prepared to do it at no charge. So all you need to do is get in touch with us. Let us know that you were on today's webinar. Let us know that you'd like us to review a copy of that lease agreement. And if that lease agreement is sent to us within 2 weeks of today's webinar, we will waive the $1,495 flat fee, and we will do that lease review for you at no charge as an attendee of today's webinar. Please, you need to reference the fact that you were on this webinar today and the date and time of the program, and send us a copy of your lease agreement, and we will, as we enter it into our system, we'll waive that $1,495 flat fee. What do we do when we read your lease? It's very simple. We spend several hours combing through it, looking for issues, flags, traps that are in your lease agreement. Then when we get on a call with you, we will ask you a little bit about who you are, what your goals and plans are, etc. We'll then get into what we found in the lease agreement. We'll then talk about how you can change or renegotiate some of those items that we found in your particular lease agreement as it relates to helping you achieve your goals. And then we'll help you come up with a proper negotiation or tactical plan to get the lease negotiated properly. And so it's a very valuable service, and for those of you that have a lease agreement, I would encourage you to take us up on it, and it's a wonderful program. Last but not least, here is my contact information and a little bit of contact information for us at Cirrus Consulting Group. You can visit our website, www.cirrusconsultinggroup.com, and on that website there is a tremendous amount of resources for dentists and dental practices across North America looking for more information on certain aspects of your lease agreement. We get featured, write blogs, write editorials, write articles in all kinds of publications, but we really try to pull them all together for you on our website. I encourage you to take down our information. Feel free to give us a call, give me a call, send an email, whatever works for you. And we hope that you got some value out of today's webinar. We appreciate your time and look forward to speaking with you soon. Take care.